Welcome. My name is David Koop, and I'm an assistant professor of computer science at Northern Illinois University. But this work was done while virtually visiting Argonne National Laboratory this past summer. I want to begin with data analysis. And of course, that begins with data. Usually with data, we progress to some computation on that data, pulling out particular features, analyzing it in some way. But along the way, we generate outputs. We generate probably more than one output, right? Tables, visualizations. From those outputs, we look at them, we understand them, we think about them, and we gain knowledge and understanding. Now, as many of you are aware, this nice linear progression isn't exactly how things work, right? Often based on what we learn, we think about things further. We go back and reanalyze outputs. We fix bugs in our code, and we go back and try out different types of data. This exploration is critical to really further the understanding in data analysis and many other fields. And I want to particularly focus on one link here between outputs that can be reused as inputs to maybe potentially new computations. So this idea of outputs becoming inputs for other computations maps to and really gives sort of a data flow structure to things, right? Any computation is dependent on an output from a previous computation. And so we can build chains of these outputs and computations to generate our final understanding. Note that along the way, we may generate some visualizations that don't directly computationally contribute to the output, but they certainly help us understand and gain knowledge in the end. Now, in the past, code was often long source files. It took a while to compile, to run. We then used offline viewers to look at what the results are. And if we had to fix something, it often took a long time to get the results back again. It was a complicated process. Notebooks are great for data analysis, right? Because we have these digestible blocks of code. We don't have 200 lines, it may be 2 or 10 lines. We have rich inline outputs. We don't have to switch between different applications to look at those outputs. And we can reuse the outputs from one cell in a second cell. In addition, we can execute and edit any cells we want. So we can go back and edit a cell, re-execute it, and see just for that particular part of the code what changed. Now, granted that I painted this pretty rosy picture of why notebooks are great, you had to expect there was a but coming. And I want to focus on a couple of those things. One is that output representations can be difficult to understand. So here we have a dictionary of tuples. Inside of there are data frames and images, right? And so this nesting is first one of the hard things to sometimes break apart. If I want to access a particular part of a complex data structure, where do I look? Where do I start, right? And at the same time, there are particular outputs like data frames that may have nice representations by themselves, but when they're embedded in these dictionaries or tuples, they get reduced to text that might be misaligned and harder to interpret. And images, which again, IPython has great, and Jupyter have great rich output capabilities, but when they're packed inside of collections, these outputs aren't visible, they're just reduced to a class name. Second issue is that recalling an output can often be difficult. So here I'm doing some data analysis, and df is a common way to refer to the current data that you're analyzing. So in this last cell on the right-hand side, the question might be, which df am I actually referring to? Which one of the 3 from the previous cells is it? Right? It's not always clear. In this case, it's actually the second cell that this is referring to. And so this nonlinearity of execution can sometimes cause problems. So hopefully I've convinced you outputs are important, but I think there are some issues, and I think we can improve them and also sort of elevate the status of output in notebooks. And that's what I want to talk about. So how do we do that? Well, I think one way we can do that is by improving the display of those outputs, right? Fix some of those issues that we see with collections of data particularly. Another way we can fix things is by improving the reuse, resolving ambiguities between which variables people think they're using and which ones they're actually using. And that goes along with enhancing the recall, the ability to recall what was done in the past. So improving output representations, what if instead of this textual output, we can move to something richer, more interactive, where we can look at the data frames as we expect them to look like. Look at the images as actual images, right? And choose what's shown and not shown, so we're not scrolling on and on and on. In the context of resolving ambiguities, instead of having variables that we think we know what they mean, but we don't actually, we can make this more explicit. We can have users tag cells so that they can refer to a particular output of a particular cell more easily. And when they do that, those tagged scoped variables can be stored behind the scenes as persistent IDs, as persistent variables that will never change, so that we can reproduce and go back to that work a week later or a year later. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about how do we improve the output representation, the output display. So to do this, we're going to look at a demo. And what we're going to look at is soccer player data, top 100 soccer players as of December of 2019. And so we can load this data in via JSON, right? And then we can scroll through the output and look at the different players in the top 100 and various characteristics. But there's a lot of data there, so we want to pull out a particular part of that data. And we can do that, but again, there's a lot of data. We want to scroll through it. We're going to pull out some particular keys we care about. From those keys, we can add enriched outputs like images, right? Pull in the actual URL data. Now, the problem is even now we don't get to see those images because we're inside of a collection. We have to dig through things in order to access those images. So let's see how this looks using ipycollections. So again, we run the same sort of code, but instead of seeing lots of output, it's collapsed. We can expand that output to see more of the details. In addition, when we extract out a particular part, it's again collapsed, but we can also see more pieces. There's only parts of the attributes that are displayed if there are lots and lots and lots of them. When we add in the image data, this time we don't need to dig down to see those images. We can see them in line with the rest of the output. So what are the issues we identified in the current way of doing things? Well, I think there's just too much output often, especially in data analysis tasks. That leads to lots of scrolling. There are details there, but they can be difficult to locate, partially because of that scrolling. And it can also be difficult to determine how the data is nested. There's sort of a mix of things listed on one line and things listed on multiple lines. And so digging through things to figure out is furniture part of the top level dictionary or further down are difficult to figure out. And rich displays are reduced to text. We can't see those rich displays that Jupyter provides such good support for. So we're inspired by what happens in the web world, right? So in JavaScript, if you look in a web browser and how it displays its output, or in even JSON representations that IPython itself provides. So on the left-hand side, we see a version of this JSON data in Observable, another notebook environment for JavaScript. And we can see how it truncates the list, but allows the user to load in more data, right? And succinctly displays things in a more of a horizontal scrolling mode. On the right-hand side, we see IPython's JSON depiction, which again has the expand and collapse features that we like. But this is only available if you wrap your data up in a particular JSON piece and tell it to be displayed as such. Now, our solution tries to take us a bit further and look at all of the rich representations that are available in Jupyter. So here we have limited output plus the ability to load more using this button. We have collapse and expand, where a collapsed summary shows parts, truncated versions of what's in a dictionary or a collection like a list, and you can expand it for details. The levels of expansion are all aligned, so it's easy to figure out where you are in the data. And then finally, we show the rich displays as an expansion, right? You click on the arrow and you can see the image, you can see the data frame. So you might ask, how does this work? Well, there are two parts. The first is a custom IPython formatter, and the second side is on the Jupyter side to render this. So formatting output, place to start is the difference between the string method and the representation method, but I won't bore you with that. Some of the other pieces to nicely format output are Python's pprint as well as IPython's pretty library, right? And you can see the results and some of the distinctions between the two on the right-hand side. IPython also provides rich display objects for things like audio, SVG images, math, and video. But it also provides ways to customize for custom output. So if you have your own class or object, you can provide a particular HTML representation or a MIME bundle representation. In addition, you can add formatters to objects that you didn't even create, formatters that are external to the objects. So you can add different formatters for different MIME types, and you can register a formatter for each object type. So our particular custom IPython formatter, what we're doing is instead of printing things to text, we want to actually serialize the collection to JSON, and then on the renderer side, unpack that into the representation we want to see. So we'll register a new formatter with a particular vendor JSON MIME type, and we'll follow basically the same strategy that the pretty library does. But then instead of producing text, we're producing a JSON object. And so for any collection, we're going to flag those things as well as recurse, so that any rich outputs nested inside also are formatted correctly. But if an object has a rich output type already, so it has a HTML renderer or HTML format or some other MIME type, we can use its formatter directly as well. On the Jupyter side, we're specifically targeting JupyterLab. And there's great support for rendering. There's the RenderMime infrastructure, including RenderMime interfaces. So Jupyter provides some great default renderers for MIME types, like for GeoJSON and for CSV, but it also supports extensions for rendering other types of MIME types. So you can create an extension pretty easily using the cookie cutter that's available on GitHub to do this fairly quickly. Now ours is a little bit more difficult because we want to make use of existing renderers. But our renderer is going to unpack the JSON and then recursively process objects in a similar manner to how the IPython formatter worked. Collections are processed to add the expand and collapse logic and the representation. There's a difference between dictionaries and lists where we show the keys and values versus the index and the value. And any objects with rich outputs get delegated to their respective renderers. So using those other renderers requires access to the RenderMime registry, which in our case seemed to imply that we needed to make this a full JupyterLab plugin, not just the straight cookie cutter. Next, we want to examine how we can improve output reuse, but not only reuse, but helping people to recall what the outputs they've already created are. So again, we're going to start with a demo referring to that soccer data again. Here we're going to use pandas to load in the data as a CSV file, and then we're going to analyze maybe the players by their different nationalities. And again, we see this kind of haphazard piece that we see with not having the rich outputs from the ipycollections. But going further, as we rename the data frame, we want to keep the same variable. We're going to name it df again, right? Because it's still the same raw data. And when we extract those players that are older than 30, we keep the same variable. So when we extract the players that are younger than 25, we end up with an empty list, right? And we know why that is because we've redefined df. So we can go through, re-execute those cells except for the players over 30, and now get those players that are under 25. But we have this sort of non-linear execution thing here. From that, we can generate some plots, looking at different nationalities of the younger players. But if we want to now look at the plots of those players who are older than 30, we have to somehow re-execute those cells again. Better idea might be to make a variable name here, right? df over 30. But again, we have to run all the cells above it in order to then redefine this variable correctly. Right? Now we get the correct variable. And we can redefine those players that are under 25 as well, so that we can refer to them later as well. So now, to get back and show the nationalities of those older players, we can refer to the particular variable that we have now. And we can group them by positions, find that those older players tend to be more midfielders, while when we look at the younger players, or the players as a whole, the forwards tend to dominate. So if we look at this using the dataflow notebook and ipycollections, we have a similar type of analysis. But instead of having this sort of jumbled output, when we look at the different data frames, we can actually navigate by country and look at just those players from Brazil or those players from the US. We can then rename the columns, the age column, so that we can do something more meaningful. But notice that now we can tag these cells and so that we can refer to them later. And this can be something that's done after we execute the cell, right? So in this case, we've generated the older players and the younger players. And if we want to refer to them, we just click on the cell and use them. df still refers to the most recent data frame that was created. So when we want to go back, we can tag the cell over 30. And we don't have to re-execute anything to now use that reference. Right? We can go back and just refer to it as df $ over 30. We're going to scope it by the cell name, the cell tag, to now generate the plot of those older players' nationalities. And if I refer to df again, that's going to refer to whatever the most recently used df is. Again, the older players. And if I want to refer to the full data frame, again, I can use the tag. Notice that all these tags get transformed into persistent hexadecimal references so that they can always be reproduced. So what we're trying to do in emphasizing the structure of outputs is really support exploration, support reuse, and help people recall what they're doing so that they can work more efficiently. When we talk about reusing notebooks, there are different aspects we have to think about. One is the environment, having everything correctly installed in the correct versions. The other is the data. Do we have access to all the necessary data? But finally, there's this piece of execution, being able to rerun things as they were intended, right? And so those first two pieces, some of the environments like Binder and cloud-based environments, mitigate some of those issues. But execution sort of runs across different types of Jupyter installations, whether those be on a single computer or on the cloud. Some of these potholes are that if you redefine or mutate a variable, another cell may break. And the order of the cell execution matters, as we saw in the demo. Also, if you forget to run an edited cell, the saved notebook may not actually match what you expect from looking at the code. So some of the challenges here, again, to remind you, is if we have df being reused in multiple, this variable df being reused in multiple contexts, or in multiple places, multiple cells, it can be difficult to know when we have the wrong df, right? And so here we have the wrong df. We're pointing to those players over 30. We're not going to find any players that are under 25. But now, if we look at this version of the notebook, maybe somebody else looks at our notebook, or we come back to it 2 weeks later, we might also scratch our heads, right? Because it doesn't run in the order that we would expect, right? Which df actually generated this output that we see? Which df are we referring to? And maybe the cell numbers give you a bit of a clue here that we actually ran those first two cells again and then jumped to the fourth cell, right? But if you came back to this later, you might not be able to figure that out. And even sometimes those numbers don't help you figure that out. So a standard solution here is making the notebook linear, right? Making the cells run in order from top to bottom. And also using variable naming judiciously, right? Thinking about when there's a new variable that we're going to want to refer to and when we can overwrite an existing variable name. Right, so here we have particular variables that are named, like those players that are over 30 and those players that are under 25. You do have to plan ahead a little bit here, and if you edit things later, you can introduce problems, as we saw. So the dataflow notebook solution that I'm presenting really focuses on linking the cells, making it clear what the dependencies are between the cells, so that one cell's output can be required before another cell can run, if we know what these hard dependencies are. So if the system knows these, it can automatically execute dependencies before running the current cell, can show users the relationship between the cells, and generally enhance reproducibility. But it doesn't just help the system, it helps people, it helps the users as well. Now the question is, how do we actually define and encode these links? Well, IPython has been thinking about this question for a while. One of the features highlighted in the 2007 paper by Perez and Granger is that users should have access to all the session state, right? When working interactively, scientists commonly perform hundreds of computations in sequence and often might need to reuse a previous result. Well, how did that work? Well, one of the ways it worked was via the underscore to reference the last output, right? But that gets overwritten each time. Underscore n represents the nth computed result. You can even use a dictionary to index into to find that same nth result. So one of the ways we might think about addressing this is using those numeric references, right? In this case, we've rewritten the notebook to generate outputs and then refer to those previous outputs by their numeric numbers, by their numbers. Now, there's only one output per cell in this solution, and the cell numbers change every time a cell is executed. So we have to be aware of that. One way, and the first way that we thought about this in the dataflow notebook, was to replace those numeric identifiers with persistent cell IDs. And this is indicated by these hexadecimal numbers instead of numeric references, right? The idea that these things are going to persist, that the order of the numbers doesn't have any bearing here. They're just random identifiers. And that's good in that they're persistent, but it also makes them very meaningless and hard to recall. Who wants to type 8 hexadecimal characters to recall one of the particular outputs? Even with some sort of completion, this isn't very nice. So a better way was to use outputs that are named by variables, but uniquely, right? So instead of having df over and over again, we use that same judicious naming. But in cases where we don't know what's going to happen, we might have df and df2 and maybe df27 if we do a lot of transitions, right? And then remembering exactly which one of those variables becomes a little more difficult because we're only allowed to use the variable name once, right? One nice thing about having these named outputs is that we can actually put them into the notebook in that left-hand margin. So we can actually write what the name of the variable is, which helps people find those variables a little bit better. But you can't reuse the identifiers, so you have to remember more identifiers. So a hybrid solution is to reuse names, but allow an optional cell ID, right? So in the case where the previous df works, we just refer to it as df and we can redefine it. And in those places where we want to refer to a particular version of df, we can use that cell ID after the variable name with a $sign, indicating that scoping. So upon execution, those unscoped outputs actually have the cell IDs appended, right? So to make sure that things will run again, we make sure we know which version of df was referred to in each one of the cells. That's okay, but we're still having to find or recall meaningless identifiers for these scoped references. So one thing that takes it a little bit further is to use tags on the cells, right? So instead of having these hexadecimal identifiers, we can have a tag name, the full data frame, over 30, under 25. And then instead of writing in those hexadecimal identifiers, we use the tags instead here. So these make things more memorable, but we can also update the tags after we execute a cell, or even a week after. And again, these tags are transformed to persistent cell IDs at the end, right? So this seems to be a good balance between having the reproducibility, knowing the links between the cells, but also providing some flexibility for users to reuse variables and to tag things so that they're more memorable. So how does this work? Well, it's a custom IPython kernel and then a custom JupyterLab notebook extension. So some of the previous work worked with Jupyter Notebook and a custom kernel for that. This takes it a step further to work with JupyterLab, which is the path forward for Jupyter. So df kernel is a modified IPython kernel. The cells run as closures, so if you define variables inside of a cell, only those that are flagged as outputs will be accessible from other cells. It keeps the dependencies up to date. When you run a cell and a dependency is out of date, it makes sure to rerun those other cells as well. This is an updated version that works with newer IPython versions, and it does some work parsing the scoped variables, those variables with the $sign, to convert between the different identifier references. On the Jupyter side, we have dfnotebook extension. So this basically takes the core standard notebook extension and modifies it to allow multiple outputs per cell that are tagged, supports setting and displaying cell tags, and also provides uses the execute input messages sent back from the kernel to actually overwrite the original user code with these persistent IDs so that they get stored in the notebook ipynb files. One interesting side note is the best way we found to sort of leverage the existing notebook code was to actually make it kind of the core notebook. So disable, we'd have to install it. You have to disable the core default notebook and then install this extension, which becomes the notebook extension then. So with that, I'd like to remember that where we started was thinking about the structure of notebooks by their outputs, letting outputs drive exploration. And to do that, we need rich outputs. We need to better display them. And we also need to make sure that people can recall and reuse those outputs without rerunning and rewriting code. So ipycollections focuses on those output displays, and the dfnotebook, the dataflow notebook, focuses on recalling and reusing those past outputs. With that, I invite you to, again, look at dataflownb.github.io to see these solutions. And also, if you have ideas or want to contribute, get in touch with us. We'll also post a link to the user study on that site.